It began with a sound that simply did not belong in the world of the living. Have you ever heard a noise so full of raw pain that it makes the hair on your arms stand right up? That is exactly what Elias Boone heard on that blistering hot Kansas afternoon. He had been walking toward the main house of the Miller Ranch, his jaw set firm with a sense of injustice. Old man Miller had sold him a fine horse, taken his hard-earned money, and then suddenly claimed the animal had gone lame. Elias was no fool. He knew a crooked deal when he saw one, and he was determined to get his money back or the horse he had paid for. But as he walked past the big, weathered red barn, that terrible, inhuman sound sliced cleanly through the air. It was not the shriek of someone who was startled, or the cry of someone who had a simple accident. It was a ragged, horrifying scream that sounded like it was being torn from the very soul of a creature in its final moments of agony. The sound was so completely unnatural, so steeped in absolute despair, that it froze him right where he stood. For a long moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. If you believe that one single moment can change a person's life forever, please stick around to see how this one man's courage uncovered a dark and terrible secret. The Kansas sun was a truly merciless force on that particular day, beating down relentlessly on the dry, cracked soil. The air itself felt thick and heavy, like a suffocating wool blanket that you just could not escape from. Every single breath he took felt like a struggle, filling his lungs with the fine dust kicked up by the hot, dry wind. Waves of heat shimmered and rose from the empty fields, making the distant horizon seem to dance and quiver. Even the birds were completely silent, wisely taking shelter in the sparse shade offered by the lonely cottonwood trees. It was the kind of oppressive, draining heat that saps a person's will and makes you want to do nothing but sit perfectly still. But that awful, chilling scream cut right through the heavy stillness like a shard of ice. It paid no mind to the heat, the dust, or the bone-deep silence of the long afternoon. It was a sound that clearly belonged in a cold, dark, and terrifying place, not a sun-drenched American farm. For a brief second, Elias wondered if the intense heat was playing tricks on his mind, causing him to imagine things. He had heard men cry out in pain on battlefields a long way from home, but this sound was profoundly different. This was the unmistakable sound of pure, undiluted terror in the middle of a seemingly peaceful day. He was suddenly reminded of a rabbit he had once seen caught in a farmer's trap, its desperate struggles growing weaker with every passing second. The awful sound he heard had that same terrible note of finality, the sound of all hope being completely extinguished. It sounded exactly like something precious and irreplaceable being broken beyond any hope of repair. Forgetting completely about his lost money and the supposedly lame horse, Elias immediately changed his direction. His old, worn leather boots made soft, urgent thuds in the dusty ground as he moved quickly toward the barn. His heart began to pound a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs, a slow and steady drumbeat of pure dread. His eyes traced the impossible angles of her ankles, which were bent in ways nature never intended, showing the deep, dark bruising of someone who had fought against immense force. The damage was profound, a brutal story told on her body, speaking of a prolonged and vicious struggle designed to break her spirit as much as her bone. The horror of it radiated from deep within her, a violation so complete it felt as if she had been unmade. With a surge of instinct, she tried to cover herself, to hide the awful evidence. Her legs, which would not obey her, were a territory of pain she tried to reclaim with hands that shook so badly they looked like fluttering birds. A tiny broken sound escaped her lips, a plea that was barely audible. "Please," she whispered, "do not leave me to die out here alone. It hurts so," she breathed it out, the words catching in her throat. "I cannot feel my legs. I cannot move." In that moment, Elias felt a cold, hard stone form in his gut. A heavy weight of cold fury and deep sorrow settled in his chest, making it difficult to draw a full breath in the crisp evening air. His mind raced, cataloging the scene with a grim certainty. This was no simple accident, no unfortunate tumble down a rocky path. This was not a fall from a horse or a slip on wet leaves. This was the deliberate work of a monster, an act of pure, calculated cruelty. A kind of cruelty that took its time enjoying the process, and it was done by a person who was supposed to be a guardian, a protector. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this had been done by someone she trusted. He carefully took off his worn hat and placed it on the damp earth beside him. The simple, respectful gesture was all he could offer for a moment. He cleared his throat and made his voice as gentle as a summer breeze, robbing it of all anger. He started with a single word, hoping it would sound safe. "Ma'am," he said softly, letting the word hang in the air between them as a promise. "My name is Elias," he continued, offering his identity as a shield, a way to show her he was a person, not a threat. "I promise I will not hurt you. I just need to see where you are injured," he explained, his voice low and steady. "Please let me see what is wrong. I need to understand what happened so I can help you." After a long moment, she responded with a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of her head. It was so slight, so fragile that if he had blinked, he would have missed it, but he saw the immense courage it took for her to do even that. When she spoke, her voice was the faint, dry rustle of dead leaves, a ghost whisper that carried the echoes of screams. "My name is Hannah," she managed to say, reclaiming a piece of herself. Then with a heartbreaking formality, she added, "Please, sir, take me away from this place. Please, I am begging you." The raw desperation in her voice cemented his resolve into something as hard as steel. Elias moved toward her, his actions slow and deliberate, making sure she could see his every intention. He kept his hands open and visible, a clear sign of peace. He knelt beside her, his knees sinking into the cold mud, and reached down with one steady hand to gently support her shattered leg. His goal was simple and practical. He needed to assess the injury, to see how much blood she had lost, and to stop any more from seeping out. But the very second his warm hand made contact with her cold skin, Hannah let out a sharp, piercing cry that tore through the quiet woods. In a flash of desperate energy, she lunged forward, grabbing the front of his thick work shirt with both of her trembling hands. Her fingers, surprisingly strong, balled up the fabric and dug into his chest, her knuckles showing white with the strain of her grip. She was like a person lost at sea, clinging to the first solid piece of rock they find, holding on for dear life. And it was in that moment he understood. A cold, horrifying realization washed over him. Looking at the pale, clammy quality of her skin, he knew she had been lying in that very spot for a very long time. She had been here through the changing light of the afternoon, and now into the deep shadows of dusk. She had been here for hours, maybe even since the morning. Through his own hand, he could feel the unnatural radiating heat coming from her swollen and discolored flesh, a sure sign of infection and terrible deep tissue damage. Skin. The heat radiating from her leg was a living thing, a palpable malevolence under his fingertips. It was the kind of deep, searing heat that spoke not just of injury, but of something far worse. It was the undeniable warmth of a poison spreading, a sign that a serious infection was already taking hold deep within her body. The thought sent a chill down Elias Boone's spine. Elias was a simple man with a simple code, and at the very top of that code was a single rule. You do not turn your back on suffering. He had lived his entire life by that rule. He had never once broken it, not for fear, not for convenience, not for anything. And he sure was not about to start now, not with this poor woman lying helpless in the dirt and shadows of this forgotten barn. Her life depended on it. He slowly raised his head, his gaze traveling past the splintered barn door and toward the main ranch house. A silent, grim confirmation settled in his gut. The place was completely and utterly empty, a hollow shell. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no horse in the paddock, no sign of life. Not one single indication of the husband she had spoken of with such fear in her voice. There was not a single sign of any living soul who might have cared one bit whether this woman in front of him lived to see another sunrise or died right here on this bed of hay. He turned his attention back to her, his expression softening with a resolve she could not mistake. He leaned in closer and spoke her name gently. Hannah. His voice was a low, steady anchor in the swirling sea of her pain and fear. I am getting you out of here. He paused, letting his words sink in, making sure she understood. I promise you that. At his words, her eyes, which had been glazed with pain, opened wider. They were filled with a wild, desperate light. It was a chaotic battle between the terror that had been her only companion and a fragile new thing called hope. She tried to speak, but her voice was a thin, trembling whisper, catching in her throat as she asked the question that haunted her. "Sir," she stammered, her gaze locking with his, "if you help me now, will all that danger, will my husband's trouble follow you too? Will he come after you for this kindness?" And as Elias looked into her terrified, hopeful eyes, he felt the true weight of that question settle down hard on his shoulders. It felt like the heavy, oppressive air that comes just before a violent storm, because he knew with absolute certainty the truth of her words. Oh yes, danger was most definitely coming. It was a shadow already racing toward them. So here is the big question I have to ask you, the person listening to this story right now. If you were the one standing in that dusty, quiet barn with a woman broken and begging for a chance to live, and you knew that a cruel, heartless man was sure to return at any moment, full of rage, what would you do? Would you risk it all? Would you have the courage to save her too? In that moment, Hannah's hand shot out and she clung to Elias's arm. It was not a gentle touch. It was the desperate grip of someone drowning, holding on to the very last solid thing in a world that had turned to water and was pulling her under. She held on for dear life. Her breath was no longer steady. It came in short, sharp, painful bursts that tore from her chest, each one a struggle. Every time a wave of pain made her instinctively try to pull her injured legs closer to her body for comfort, she could not stop the sharp hiss of agony that escaped through her clenched teeth. The sight of it solidified Elias's resolve. He knew with a chilling certainty that she could not stay in the cold dampness of that barn for one single minute longer. Time was running out. Without another word, he carefully and deliberately slid one strong arm under her back. With a care that defied his rough, weathered hands, he positioned one strong arm behind her shoulders, supporting her completely. He then slid his other arm gently beneath the bend of her knees, making sure to lift her with as much tenderness as a man of his many years could possibly summon. The strength he possessed was not of youth, but of enduring will, and he lifted her from the dirty straw. A sudden, sharp gasp escaped her lips, but it wasn't a sound born of fear. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, a breath she had been holding for what felt like an eternity. With her held securely in his arms, he began to carry her out of that place of shadows. He walked her out into the brilliant, almost blinding heat of the afternoon Kansas sunlight. As he moved, her head found a natural resting place upon his chest. She could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, a sound of life and safety that was a stark contrast to the silence she had known. Her thin fingers, pale and trembling, remained tightly clenched in the fabric of his worn work shirt, as if she were afraid he might disappear. For a long, significant second, as the light hit her, she was forced to squint her eyes against the vast, open expanse of the prairie, a world stretching out to a horizon she had not seen in so long. It was as if her mind, captive for so long in the gloom, had genuinely forgotten the sheer scale and beauty of what the world looked like. She stared in awe as if seeing the sky for the very first time, completely overwhelmed by the simple reality of being outside that terrible dark stall. A gentle summer wind, warm and carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wildflowers, brushed softly across her face like a comforting hand. It was such a simple, natural thing, that warm prairie wind, yet that small kindness from the world itself was enough to make her start to cry all over again. But these were different tears. Softly, with his own movements a bit shaky from the effort, Elias carefully placed her onto the saddle of his waiting horse. His large, calloused hands were there instantly, steadying her fragile frame as she shifted her weight, cautiously trying to find a way to sit that would not put pressure on her legs, moving with a pained, deliberate slowness. She held her breath with every small adjustment, trying to keep her limbs from touching anything that might cause another jolt of pain. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low and steady rumble. "I have got you." The calm in his tone was absolute and deeply comforting. It was the kind of unwavering, solid voice a good man earns only after he has weathered a full lifetime of hard labor, heartache, and unforgiving years. From her position on the horse, she slowly looked down at the kind, older man who was saving her. Her eyes were still wide and haunted, filled with a deep and understandable fear. But now, for the first time, a different kind of light flickered there in their depths, struggling to break through the darkness. It was something incredibly small and fragile, a tiny ember of hope that was stubbornly trying to wake up from a long, terrible sleep. After ensuring she was secure, Elias swung himself up onto the horse behind her, his movements fluid and practiced, and immediately gathered her into a bracing, protective hold. He encircled her with both of his strong arms, creating a human shield around her so that there was no possible way she would fall from the horse. And then they were moving. With every steady, rhythmic hoof beat on the dusty trail, Hannah found herself able to breathe just a little bit deeper than before, letting the air fill her lungs more fully. Every single bump and dip in the dirt road sent a sharp jolt through her bruised body that made her wince in pain. But she did not complain or make a single sound of protest. Not one single time. Instead, she allowed herself to lean her head back against Elias's solid chest, a profound gesture of newfound trust, and she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, "You really are taking me away from here." He did not speak, but she felt his chest move as he gave a single firm nod against her hair, a silent and solemn promise. "Yes, ma'am," Elias confirmed, his voice a steady rumble that seemed to calm the very air around them. "We are absolutely not looking back from this moment on." The journey stretched on for what felt like an eternity, the slow, rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves marking the passage of countless hours. This long ride was enough for the sun to make its lazy journey across the sky, finally dipping toward the western horizon, painting the clouds in brilliant shades of orange and gold. That beautiful fading light spilled across the vast open plains, making the tall grass glow, as if it were spun from precious metal, and it was in this gentle light that Elias finally talked. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words were like smooth stones skipping across a quiet pond, talking about simple, easy things. He commented on the changing weather, pointed out the unique shapes of the distant hills, and shared quiet stories about the spirited horses he had known. He fondly recalled a stubborn but loyal Mustang he had tamed when he was a much younger man, a horse everyone else had given up on. There was no weight to his words, no hidden questions or heavy sighs, just the comfortable sound of a good man filling the silence. Nothing in his tone or his stories made her want to pull away. There was no judgment, no prying, nothing that made her feel small or afraid. His gentle conversation was just enough to keep her exhausted mind from drifting into darkness, and it seemed to chase away the worst of her worries. He helped her fight off the ice-cold fear that had been her constant companion for years, the one that was always trying to crawl its way back up her spine. By the time the distant, comforting shape of the Boone Ranch finally appeared on the horizon, the fear had quieted to a dull ache. As the ranch came into clear view, a deep tremor ran through Hannah's body, a shiver that was born from pure, bone-deep exhaustion and overwhelming relief. She stared at the endless lines of clean white fences that seemed to go on for miles, a symbol of order and safety she had not seen in years. Her eyes drank in the sight of the big, sturdy barn with its welcoming bright red doors, and she could hear the gentle, lowing sounds of cattle from a distant pasture. Every single detail of this peaceful place, from the smell of the clean air to the quiet sounds of the farm, felt completely foreign to her. It was so surreal. She felt as though she had accidentally wandered onto a movie set or into the pages of a beautiful storybook. She felt like she had stepped into a life that was meant for someone else, a peaceful existence that she did not believe she deserved. It was a life where the very air she breathed did not feel heavy with anger, and where people communicated in calm, measured tones. This was a world where people spoke without the need for shouting, and as she took this all in, Elias gently carried her out of the wagon. He brought her across the porch and into the warm, welcoming light of his house, then called out for an older woman named Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper, the kind-faced housekeeper with gentle eyes, appeared almost instantly, and Elias asked her in a quiet voice to prepare a few things. He told her to please bring a basin of warm water, some soft soap, and a stack of fresh, clean linens for their unexpected guest. Overwhelmed by this undeserved kindness, Hannah found her voice and tried to whisper an apology, ashamed for being such a terrible burden to them. Elias immediately stopped her, shaking his head firmly and looking her directly in the eye, saying, "No, ma'am, do not even think that. You are not one bit of a burden, pup," he said. And the words were so simple, so honest, that they cut through all her years of doubt. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she actually believed what someone was telling her, letting his sincerity wash over her. She finally gave herself permission to relax, to let the tension leave her shoulders and the fear loosen its grip on her heart as she let herself rest. But just as she allowed her weary eyes to close, a single terrifying thought managed to claw its way through the fog of her exhaustion. It was a dark and persistent thought that pushed its way back into the front of her mind, the chilling memory of her husband. Elias knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that Caleb would eventually come looking for what he considered his property. So the situation presented a very serious question that hung heavy in the air. What is a truly cruel man capable of when he finally realizes his power is gone? What terrible things would he do when he discovers that the gentle woman he had tormented for so long has finally found her freedom? And more importantly, what would a good man like Elias do to protect her? What would happen when that cruel man and his followers showed up uninvited at the peaceful sanctuary of Boone Ranch? The air grew thick with tension, because a fight was not just possible, it was absolutely inevitable. Hannah had only been a guest at the Boone Ranch for 2 short days, a brief period of peace that felt like a lifetime. But just as she started to feel safe, trouble finally rode over the horizon, kicking up a storm of dust and anger. Elias spotted the disturbance first, his sharp eyes catching the faint plume of dust in the distance. It was a long, thin trail rising ominously. The trail of dust grew thicker as it came over the fence line, revealing a group of riders moving with a reckless and aggressive speed. Dawes. Elias knew immediately that these were not friendly visitors coming for a neighborly chat. Their posture screamed hostility. At that very moment, Hannah was resting peacefully inside the main house, propped up carefully with several soft pillows. The kindly Mrs. Harper had made sure the pillows were stuffed with fresh, sweet-smelling cotton, a small comfort that meant the world to Hannah. Understanding the need to shield her from what was coming, Elias stepped out onto the porch with quiet, deliberate steps. He gently shut the heavy wooden door behind him, the soft click of the latch sounding loud in the sudden silence. He did not want her to hear the ugly, angry shouts that were now rolling like thunder across the fields. The lead rider, Caleb Miller, charged directly toward the ranch house with a breathtaking arrogance. He rode straight into the neatly kept yard as if he owned every inch of the land, his horse's hooves tearing up the grass. With a violent tug on the reins, he yanked his poor, lathered horse to a jarring and dramatic stop. He then raised his arm and pointed a trembling, dirt-caked finger directly at Elias, his face a mask of pure fury. He barked out his demand, his voice filled with venom. "Bring my wife out here to me this instant." His voice was so strained with rage that it cracked loudly in the quiet afternoon air, sounding almost like a gunshot. Despite the sudden and violent intrusion, Elias did not so much as flinch, standing his ground as solid as an old oak tree. He had been a working cowboy, facing down all sorts of dangers, since he was just a boy of 15. The loud and angry yelling of entitled men had long ago lost its power to rattle or intimidate him. But there was something different about this man. It was the way Caleb's eyes burned with a dark and possessive fire. It was the disgusting, contemptuous way he spat out the word wife, as if he were talking about a piece of livestock he owned. That particular insult stirred a hot, protective anger deep within Elias's chest, a feeling he hadn't known for a long time. Caleb clumsily swung himself down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a thud, and immediately began to advance. He stormed right up to Elias, invading his personal space, his face twisted with accusation as he snarled, "You are the one who took her. You think you are some kind of hero, but you are just a thief who stole her from me, and believe me, I'm going to drag her right back where she belongs, kicking and screaming if I have to." Elias, however, kept his voice as calm and steady as a quiet lake, even though a storm was raging inside of him. "She is badly hurt, Caleb. She is terrified. And most importantly, she chose to come with me because she finally wanted to be free from you and this place. She wanted to finally leave all of this behind." Caleb let out a harsh, ugly sneer, the sound full of disbelief and arrogance. "Wanted to leave? Don't make me laugh, Elias. You need to understand something very simple. That woman is mine. She does exactly what I say." That single chilling sentence was the one that pushed Elias past the point of no return, shattering his carefully maintained composure like a stone through glass. He took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet firmly in the dirt, and said, "Not today, Caleb. She absolutely does not. And I promise you, she will not be yours ever again for the rest of her life." In a flash of fury, Caleb shoved him with both hands, a clumsy and desperate move. Elias barely stumbled, then shoved back with a solid, controlled force that sent Caleb reeling. Caleb swung a wild, looping punch, landing a hard, stinging hit just under Elias's left eye. The sharp impact immediately split the skin, and a warm trickle of blood began to run down his cheek, blurring his vision for a dangerous, heart-stopping moment. But just before the two hired hands Caleb brought with him could swarm Elias and overwhelm him, one of the trusted ranch cowboys, a man named Jake, came running from the main barn, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth, shouting at the top of his lungs that Elias was not going to be fighting this battle by himself today. And that one simple, loyal act was all it took for the tense, simmering confrontation to finally explode into an all-out brawl right there in the dusty yard. Caleb, completely consumed by his rage, came at him again, swinging his fists wildly and without any real thought or skill, more blinding anger than any sort of effective aim, while his two hired hands, seeing their chance, rushed in right behind him, hoping to end the fight quickly with their numbers. But Elias was ready, and he ducked low, letting the clumsy punch sail harmlessly over his head. In the same motion, he grabbed Caleb by the front of his expensive shirt, twisting the fabric in his fist, and used Caleb's own momentum to slam him hard into the solid wooden side of the nearby water trough, knocking the wind out of him. The two hired hands jumped into the fray immediately, trying to grab Elias from behind, but Elias and his friend Jake, the ranch cowboy, moved together like a well-oiled machine, like two men who were fighting with a true and righteous purpose. All those long, hard years of difficult ranch work had carved a deep, practical strength into their bodies, a kind of raw power that these two city boys in Caleb's pay absolutely did not expect and were not prepared for in the slightest. With a grunt of effort, Elias spun around and threw one of the hired hands straight to the dirt, while Jake, the ranch cowboy, reached out and yanked the other man backward by his collar so hard that his feet nearly left the ground, completely neutralizing him. The force of the blow was more than just painful. It was a deep, shocking insult to Caleb's pride, a fiery agony that was more than enough to make him howl with both rage and hurt. Then, as Caleb was still processing the raw humiliation, Elias straightened up, his shoulders squared and his face a mask of cold determination. He turned his full attention back to Caleb, who was now desperately trying to get back on his feet. The man was scrambling in the dusty yard, kicking up dirt and looking less like a threat and more like a panicked animal trying to escape a trap it never saw coming. He pushed himself up, his face red and swollen, his chest puffed out with wounded pride, looking for all the world like a furious rooster, readying for a fight it had already lost. In a flash, before Caleb could even find his balance, Elias closed the distance between them and grabbed him. His hand shot out and clamped down on Caleb's thick collar, twisting the fabric until it dug tightly into the man's neck. "Let me make something perfectly clear to you," Elias said, his voice low and rumbling with a quiet menace. "If you ever think about coming near this house or her again," his grip tightened, lifting Caleb slightly off the ground, forcing him to meet his gaze, "you better be absolutely sure you are prepared for the consequences. You better not come alone, and you better come with a lot more than just your usual empty threats. In fact," Elias finished, his eyes as hard as stone, "you had better bring a preacher with you and have your last words memorized and ready to go, because I promise you it will be the very last time you bother anyone." The raw, undisguised promise of violence in Elias's voice finally broke through Caleb's anger. He took a clumsy step back, then another, his entire body shaking with a fury he could not unleash. It was a terrible, powerless rage that consumed him. Every part of him wanted to lunge forward, to wipe the calm, steady look off Elias's face, but he was too scared to take that final step. For the first time, he had met a wall he could not push over, and the realization left him frozen and afraid. As a final act of pathetic defiance, he spat a thick glob of saliva into the dirt near Elias's boots. He then turned and clumsily mounted his horse, his movements jerky and filled with uncontrolled anger, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant swagger. He yanked hard on the reins, spinning the horse around and kicking it into a gallop. As he rode off, he shouted back over his shoulder, his voice cracking with rage, promising that this was not over, that Elias would live to regret this day. The words were a bitter promise that hung in the air long after he was gone. Elias stood completely still in the cloud of settling dust, watching the retreating figure until it was just a small speck on the horizon. His chest was rising and falling heavily. He drew in a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline from the confrontation still pumping through his veins. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides, and it took a conscious effort for him to slowly relax them, finger by finger. He was under no illusion that his warning had solved the problem. He knew men like Caleb. He knew their pride was as fragile as it was enormous, and he was fully aware that this violent exchange was not an ending, but a beginning. The real fight had only just begun, and all the while on the other side of that thin wooden door, inside the safety of the small house, Hannah was listening. She was hidden from sight, pressed up against the door, feeling the vibrations of the shouting through the old wood. She had heard the sickening thud of the punch, the venom in Caleb's voice, and the terrifying quiet calm in Elias's threat. She had heard enough to make her whole body start to tremble uncontrollably all over again, a familiar and awful feeling. Her knees felt weak and her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But as the seconds ticked by and silence fell over the yard, she realized that this time the shaking felt different. This was not the same old fear she had lived with for so long. She trembled not just from fear of Caleb's inevitable return, but from a profound, earth-shattering shock. It was a tremor born from witnessing something she thought she would never see, someone fighting for her. For the first time, someone was standing up for her after so much time feeling completely alone and invisible. Someone had finally stepped in. A man had physically placed himself between her and the source of her torment, acting as a shield against the darkness she faced every single day. He had not only seen her predicament, but he had also heard her silent pleas for help. And now the consequences of that brave act were about to arrive. She knew Caleb's vengeful nature, and the real storm was now gathering on the horizon. It was brewing, dark and angry, and it was heading straight for them. If you are still with us, holding your breath to see what happens, this would be a wonderful time to show your support for the story. Go on, it only takes a second. Just scroll down a little bit and hit that subscribe button for our channel. Give it a nice, gentle click. That way you become part of our story community, and you will get a notification the moment the next chapter is released. We would hate for you to miss out on the incredible events that are about to unfold. So just take a moment, nice and easy, so you do not have to go searching for us later. We will come right to you. You absolutely will not want to miss what happens next, because the storm that is coming is going to change everything for Hannah and Elias. We promise you that. And while you are there, how about you grab a warm cup of coffee or tea, get settled in your favorite chair, and drop us a little note in the comments? We truly love hearing from everyone who tunes in. Let us know what time it is for you, what part of the country or what part of the world you are in. It is always a joy to see how far our stories travel and who they reach along the way. We appreciate every single one of you listening from all over. Now let's get back to that fateful afternoon. Caleb rode off in a cloud of furious dust that day, but the trouble he stirred up was far from gone. In fact, the dust he left behind as a symbol of his rage and wounded pride never really settled at all. It seemed to hang in the air, a gritty reminder of the threat that now lingered over the small, peaceful farm. Elias felt it in his bones. He was a practical man, not prone to fantasy, and he knew that an act of defiance like his always came with a heavy price. He had poked a hornet's nest, and he knew it. Inside the house, Hannah knew it too. A fragile, tiny seed of hope had been planted in her heart, but it was surrounded by the chilling certainty that Caleb would be back, and he would not be alone next time. The quiet that followed his departure was not peaceful. The air itself felt heavier, thick with unspoken fears and the suffocating weight of what was to come, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It felt as if the entire Boone Ranch was holding its breath, caught in a deep and unnatural silence that evening. Later, long after the last rays of sunlight had vanished, Elias sat alone at his familiar, worn-out kitchen table. He cradled a steaming cup of black coffee between his rough, work-worn hands, its dark surface reflecting the flickering lamplight. He was staring blankly at the far wall, his eyes tracing the wooden planks as if a solution might magically appear there. He searched the patterns in the grain, hoping for some kind of sign, some wisdom carved into the old wood of his home. But his mind could not focus because he kept thinking about Hannah, who was finally resting in the spare room upstairs. He pictured her sleeping soundly under a thick quilt, finally feeling warm, and more importantly, finally feeling safe from harm. A cold dread washed over him as he realized how fragile that safety was, and how all of it could be ripped away in an instant. The image of Caleb returning, this time with the full force of the law on his side, played over and over in his mind. With a sudden surge of resolve, he pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the quiet room, and stood up straight. He reached for the worn felt hat that always hung on a peg by the door and settled it firmly on his head. Turning to Mrs. Harper, who was watching with worried eyes, he said, "Please keep a close eye on her. I have to go see an old friend." The urgent ride into Dodge City, which normally took a good hour, felt like it was over in a flash. Elias was pushing his horse harder than he had in years, the powerful animal sensing the desperate need for speed. He knew it was a pace too fast for a man his age, but deep worry can make a man feel young and a horse feel like it has wings. The last colors of the sunset were painting the horizon in streaks of orange and purple as he galloped toward the town. He finally pulled his sweating, tired horse to a stop, tying the reins loosely to the hitching post right outside the sheriff's office. Inside the dimly lit office, Sheriff Cole Harding, a man Elias had known for over 20 years, sat behind his large oak desk. The desk was covered in messy stacks of paperwork and wanted posters that the sheriff was clearly ignoring at the moment. Cole's head snapped up the very second the door creaked open, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto Elias. He recognized his old friend instantly, even in the dim light, and saw the storm of trouble written all over his face. "Well now, Elias Boone," the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble, "that is a face I only see when something terrible has happened." He gestured to the empty chair across from his desk, a look of genuine concern softening his stern features. "Come on in and sit down, my friend," Cole insisted gently. "Sit down before whatever is weighing on you makes you fall down." Elias gratefully took the seat, the wood groaning under his weight, but his posture remained rigid and his jaw was set tight with tension. With a deep, steadying breath, Elias began to speak, and Sheriff Cole listened intently without a single interruption. Elias told him the entire story, leaving out no detail, no matter how ugly or difficult it was to say out loud. He described the awful, dark bruises he had seen on Hannah's arms, and the deep, haunting fear he saw in her young eyes. He repeated every cruel and threatening word that Caleb had spat at him from his saddle in the yard earlier that day. When Elias finished, a heavy silence filled the room, and Cole leaned back in his creaking chair, slowly chewing on the inside of his cheek in thought. Of his cheek, a small, telltale sign of the storm brewing inside him, a habit Cole had seen in countless men on the edge. He was trying to hold himself together when the world was falling apart. Cole spoke softly, his voice full of a lawman's weary wisdom. "Elias, what that monster Caleb did to his wife is a crime, one of the worst kind, plain and devastatingly simple. But you and I both know the law out in these dusty territories does not always protect the innocent or punish the guilty the way the good books say it should. You have seen it yourself, haven't you? That ugly truth." "I know," Elias said, his voice raspy with exhaustion and simmering rage. "But that does not change a thing. I'm not sending her back to that house, back to that man's cruelty. Not as long as I have air in my lungs and strength in my arms. Breathing." Cole gave a long, slow nod, a gesture of deep respect and shared purpose. He looked Elias straight in the eye and said, "All right, son, we are going to do this the right way then, by the letter of the law, so it sticks. The very first thing we need to do is get the town doctor to put everything he saw, every bruise and every broken bone into a signed statement that no one can dispute. Next, we find every single person in the town of Abilene who ever saw Caleb so much as look at Hannah with a cruel eye or raise a hand in her direction. We need brave souls to speak the truth. And finally, we will bring Hannah herself in to testify, but only when she is strong enough to face that courtroom and tell her story without fear. Her well-being comes first, always. And we are going to gather all of this evidence and march it straight to Judge Wilbur's office before Caleb even knows what is happening and has a chance to spin his own web of lies. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias felt a fraction of the immense, crushing weight lift from the very center of his shoulders. The burden was not gone, not by a long shot, but it suddenly felt a little bit lighter, more manageable. He straightened his back and stood up, reaching across the desk to firmly shake Cole's hand. As they clasped hands, the sheriff offered a reassuring smile. "Bring Hannah to the courthouse tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. I will personally make certain that Judge Wilbur sets aside his other business and hears your side of this story, hears you both out." But that promise tomorrow, filled with so much hope, never truly arrived. When Elias and Hannah reached the courthouse, they were met with a notice. The judge had unexpectedly postponed the hearing indefinitely, with the official reason being that he needed a more substantial collection of witnesses and professionally prepared statements before he could proceed with such a serious matter. So, for the next 2 agonizing weeks, Elias found himself trapped in a grueling routine, riding his horse back and forth along the dusty trail that stretched between the quiet streets of Abilene and the bustling hub of Dodge City. He spent his days knocking on doors, pleading with neighbors who were too afraid to get involved, and carefully gathering any sworn letters he could get his hands on. He even found himself practically begging the overworked town doctor to come to the ranch on 2 separate occasions just to check on Hannah's slow recovery and write down his official medical findings. And every single night as the sun went down, Hannah would ask in a small, hopeful voice if he had made any progress that day, if justice was any closer. And every single night, Elias had to look into her eyes and break her heart all over again. Elias leaned in close, his voice a low and steady anchor in the storm of her fear, promising her that she just had to hold on a little bit longer. After making sure she was comfortable, Elias needed a moment for himself, so he quietly slipped out of the room and stepped back outside onto the porch. He looked up at the horizon where the sky was transforming into a beautiful canvas of deep purple and soft lavender as the sun finally dipped below the hills. Down the main road, the gas lamps that lined both sides of Front Street were beginning to sputter and flicker, casting a warm and gentle glow into the growing twilight. Meanwhile, miles away at the safety and solitude of the Boone Ranch, Hannah found that rest was the furthest thing from her mind as she sat anxiously in her room. She was sitting perfectly upright in the middle of the bed, waiting for his return, her eyes wide and fixed on the door, listening for any sign of his approach. Her hands were a nervous knot in her lap, twisting the fabric of the quilt over and over again until she finally heard his footsteps and was able to ask her question. Her voice was just a fragile whisper in the quiet room when she finally asked, "Is he going to come back and get me? Is Caleb coming for me?" Elias looked at her, at the raw fear in her eyes, and he knew in his heart that he could not offer her a comforting lie. He had to tell her the unvarnished truth. He explained gently that this difficult fight was not over. In fact, it was really only just getting started, and she would need all of her strength for what was ahead. And that really brings us to the core of this whole situation, so I want to ask you a question to think about as this story unfolds. What is supposed to happen when a respected judge in a tough town like Dodge City is presented with an impossible choice between two people's stories? He has to choose a side, to decide who is telling the truth between a powerful and deeply cruel husband and the one person who finally stood up to him. What happens when he must weigh the word of that man against the testimony of the woman brave enough to finally speak out against him and tell her story? On the morning the hearing was scheduled to take place, Hannah walked toward the courthouse, and the entire town seemed to be watching her every move. The large, imposing stone courthouse in the middle of Dodge City felt more imposing than ever, and inside the air felt colder than it had any right to be. It was a chilling feeling that went deeper than any harsh winter wind Hannah had ever experienced out on the plains. This was a cold that came from pure fear. She sat down on the hard wooden bench right beside Elias, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. Her breath came in short, shaky bursts, and she felt like a single autumn leaf trembling in a strong wind, trying desperately to just hold still. She focused on staying perfectly still as the proceedings began, and the town doctor was called to the stand to be the first one to speak. First, the doctor described her past injuries in clinical detail. Then an old shopkeeper from their former town in Abilene spoke about her fearful demeanor. After the shopkeeper, it was one of their former neighbors who took the stand, a woman who described an afternoon when she had seen Caleb in his yard. The neighbor's voice shook as she told the court about him yelling with such incredible rage that her own flock of chickens squawked in terror and scattered. But through all of this, the man they were all talking about, Caleb himself, was completely and mysteriously nowhere to be seen in the entire courtroom. The local law enforcement officers had not yet been able to find him or lay a single hand on him, despite having a warrant for his arrest. His absence was a mystery that made everyone whisper, and it put even more pressure on Hannah when the judge finally called her name. It was her turn. She pushed herself up from the bench slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, but she walked to the stand with a newfound sense of purpose. When she began to speak, she surprised herself as her voice came out clear and steady, filled with a strength she did not even know she possessed. Her words were calm and measured, yet they were powerful enough to reach every single person in that courtroom, and the entire room fell completely silent. But what she said next was not what anyone was expecting to hear. She did not mention the pain, and she did not mention the fear he caused. She did not speak of the violence itself, but of the long, dark shadows it cast over her soul, describing the terror of those worst nights. Instead, she spoke with a quiet, trembling voice about the simple things she yearned for, the simple human want for peace, and the desperate need for safety. She told the silent courtroom that all she ever truly wanted was the fundamental right to close her eyes at night, to welcome sleep as a friend. She wanted to be able to rest without the crippling fear of what the darkness might bring. And when her soft-spoken testimony finally ended, a profound hush fell over the room. Even the formidable Judge Wilbur, a man known for his stern and unreadable expression, simply sat there on his bench, completely silent for a long, heavy moment. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to speak. And then he slowly, deliberately, cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet. And then, in a voice that was surprisingly gentle yet firm, Judge Wilbur spoke the powerful words that would completely and utterly change the course of her life forever. With all the authority of the law behind him, Judge Wilbur announced that the court would grant Hannah's request for immediate relief. He declared that she would officially receive a temporary order of protection, a legal shield to stand between her and the man who haunted her. This order was crystal clear in its purpose, legally keeping Caleb a significant distance away from her person, and just as importantly, away from the sanctuary of the ranch. He was forbidden from setting one foot on the property of Boone Ranch, the place that had become her safe harbor in a terrible storm. The judge went on to explain that this was just the first step, and a full comprehensive hearing would be officially scheduled in the coming weeks. This would give the sheriff's office enough time to make sure that more witnesses were properly located and their statements were carefully gathered. It also provided a crucial window of time for the lawmen to complete their investigation and to track Caleb down, wherever he might be hiding. Hannah understood perfectly that this was not the final victory, not the end of the long and difficult road that still lay ahead of her. But in her heart, she knew with absolute certainty that it was the first real, tangible step toward that final triumphant moment of true freedom. As the judge's words settled, it felt as though the very air inside the dusty courtroom had changed, suddenly feeling brighter and much, much lighter. A feeling of reverence washed over the room, a sense that justice had been served, making the ordinary space feel almost holy. Hannah slowly lowered herself back onto the hard wooden bench, her legs feeling weak with relief, and the breath she finally let out felt monumental. It was a deep, shuddering exhale, and she realized it was the first truly free breath she had managed to take in what felt like a lifetime. In that powerful moment, Elias turned his head and looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and profound relief for her. She met his gaze, and as their eyes locked, she looked back at him, and absolutely nothing needed to be said between them. There are certain rare moments in life that manage to say everything that needs to be said, communicating volumes of emotion and understanding. Their shared glance was one of those moments, an entire conversation of hope, gratitude, and promise, all conveyed without a single spoken word. The days that followed began to heal her, as several quiet, peaceful months passed by on the ranch, each one a gift. At first, Hannah found comfort helping Mrs. Harper in the warm, fragrant kitchen. Then she moved to the sun-drenched garden, feeling the earth in her hands. Finally, she found her way out to the stables, working with the horses, a sure sign that her physical and emotional strength had fully returned. And almost every single evening, as the sun would set over the rolling hills, Elias often found himself pausing in his work, his attention drawn to her. He would find himself watching her as she shared a genuine, easy laugh with Mrs. Harper, the sound like a melody he had longed to hear. Or he would catch himself just listening to her quietly hum a cheerful little tune to herself while she carefully folded the clean laundry. He was folding a freshly cleaned tablecloth, the scent of sunshine and soap filling the small laundry room, when he realized something profound had shifted in his quiet world. The change was gentle but sure, like the turning of a season, an undeniable warmth seeping back into the cold corners of his house and his heart. She was healing, and so was he, in ways he hadn't even known he was broken. One particularly crisp morning, as the sun painted the prairie gold, Hannah woke up much earlier than usual, feeling a strange wave of dizziness wash over her as she sat up, her face looking pale in the morning light. And dear Mrs. Harper, who was already in the kitchen, took one look at her and smiled that special, knowing smile that only older, wiser women seem to possess when they have seen this exact story play out 100 times before and already know the final chapter by heart. Later that very afternoon, after a quiet trip into town, the kind old doctor with spectacles perched on his nose confirmed their shared, unspoken suspicion. Hannah, against all odds and against the cruelest lies she had been told, was carrying a child. When she finally found the courage to tell Elias that evening, his hand, which was halfway to his mouth with a spoonful of stew, froze in midair. He went completely still, his eyes wide. Then he sat down hard in his wooden chair, which groaned under the sudden weight, as if someone had punched him squarely in the gut and knocked all the air right out of him. Seeing his shock, a cold wave of fear washed over Hannah. She worried desperately that he was angry or disappointed by this unexpected complication. But then, after a long silence, a small, breathy chuckle escaped his lips, a sound of pure disbelief, and he slowly shook his head, wiped a sudden wetness from the corner of his eyes with the back of his hand, and said in a shaky voice, "Well, I will be. Just look at that. A miracle right here in our own home." He looked from her to the ceiling and back again, his face full of wonder. "It just goes to show you," he added softly, "life still finds a way, doesn't it?" For Hannah, hearing those words, seeing his reaction, it was so much more than just the news of a child. It was the ultimate proof, the undeniable validation that she had never been broken, no matter what Caleb had tried to make her believe. It was absolute proof that gentle kindness in a safe harbor can grow the most beautiful things, things that a bitter heart and a cruel spirit never could. Far away on the dusty, windswept prairie, living a life of his own making, Caleb eventually caught wind of the news. A passing traveler carrying gossip from town told him that his former wife Hannah was expecting a child. The color drained from his face and he froze, completely stunned that the woman he had discarded as useless could actually carry a child after all the lies he had told himself and her. Then, as the shock wore off, his face contorted into a terrible mask, a mixture of bitter regret for his monumental mistake and a pure, unyielding anger at her happiness. He kicked at the dirt and muttered to the empty plains that this was not the end of their story, not by a long shot. But back in that warm, safe house, Hannah finally understood. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she felt a deep, settled peace. She felt completely and utterly worthy of love. Not a frantic, desperate love, but real love, quiet love, the kind that builds a home and stays for a lifetime. Now, after hearing all of this, I have to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with yourself. If you had been in Elias Boone's shoes that day, seeing a woman in desperate need on the side of the road, Would you have had the simple human courage to stop and step in, to offer help when it seemed like nobody else in the world would? So we have to ask ourselves, what would we do? And if you were standing right where Hannah was, what would your choice have been? Would you have found the incredible strength to begin a new chapter, especially when it felt like the entire world was shouting for you to stay put, when every voice around you was filled with doubt and discouragement? It takes a special kind of courage to listen to your own heart in a noisy room. Hannah found that courage deep within herself. She chose to believe in a future that only she could see at the time. It is easy to say we would be brave from the comfort of our chairs, but to actually take that first step into the unknown is something else entirely. To risk everything on a glimmer of hope is a true test of character.